of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be pleasing in your sight, O God, our rock and our redeemer.
So I'm going to make an assumption that these particular scriptures are not our favorite. That lots of nodding heads. Yes, yes, yes. Okay. So what does this bring up for you? What feelings? Resistance. Why? The best we can with the knowledge that we have from Cindy. What other feelings arise when we are listening to these scriptures? Discouragement. Discouragement about what? So the division of the second scripture and the idea that it's a punishment in that first scripture talking about the vineyard. What other feelings kind of come up as we're talking about? Amanda, I guess I can have the microphone. Sorry.
Well, just given the violence around us in the world today, it's horrifically dismaying when the one we think of as holy seems to be countenancing violence of any sort, and when Jesus seems to be suggesting, if not sort of actual physical violence, then conflict even between people who love each other.
Yeah, this idea of conflict. Anyone else? What else comes up as we're talking about these two scriptures? Linda.
Well, that old quote about a house divided against itself, I don't know exactly where that comes in, but I don't think forever we could do that, stay divided like that and persist.
So what I'm hearing is that the idea of division causes us really great anxiety. Does anyone want to elaborate why? Cindy.
I think it connects us or takes us away from belonging. And I know our current time and the division I have had with my father is unsettling. And part of that is because I want to be known as positive in my relationships. But when I have to put boundaries around someone in order to maintain my own mental health, there's a division. And I think there's a deeper concept. Because if we are all created by God, everything around us, even the cement below our feet, then dividing that up is like cutting up the body of God. And even people I disagree with are still created by God and have that goodness that comes into it. So when we talk about God dividing and destroying, it's unsettling.
I heard something in what you shared, though, that sometimes division or boundaries is self-protective, right? That sometimes who we are in relationship with has to change for either our overall wellness or wellness in general. And so in our tradition of Christianity, where we very much want to believe in an all-loving God, when God sets boundaries, we get really uncomfortable, right? But we also have in our tradition that God is consistently on the side of the oppressed, consistently choosing people from the underside of history to make God's home with. And so what we get from that first song, which is an amazing poem which has been adapted into hymn lyrics, it was a poem in protest of the Mexican-American War, which is when the United States, in an act of colonization, took about half of Mexico. And what we now consider Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, all of that was all Mexico. And then in this war became the American colonial project annexed this land, including all of the indigenous people who lived there, causing them immense violence and harm. So we get this hymn text, which is a protest, that says throughout it, at some point, you're gonna have to choose. And which will you choose? It's gonna make people uncomfortable if you choose. And it really pushes against this idea of unity. So there's a question here. We love Jesus as the Prince of Peace, the one who reconciles all people, all creation back to God. And also, we have Jesus consistently choosing the people who are being pushed out of the power structure in his lived experience, his lived day and age. So what do we do with this paradox? This idea of infinite grace which reconciles all things back to itself. And this idea of boundaries, saying, no, choosing is divisive. And where do we land in that spectrum? So my question for us is, why is unity the primary value? Why is that the thing that we are always striving for? Anybody up online? Karima, go ahead.
I think if we were trying to accomplish something and we were all together working towards it, it would have a better chance of success than if we're, not just trying to accomplish something, but also fighting against some of the people in the community because they don't want it to happen.
Sure, that begs the question, when we talk about unity, who are we unifying with? Deborah.
Well, if my enemy and I are arguing and a bear comes toward us, my enemy is now my best friend against the bear. So I think there's a survival aspect to the concept of community and unity.
Unless they run faster than you.
What did she say?
I mean, but you're right. Groups that we are unified with is a sociological principle that has created society, right? And it is about sharing our resources, about caring for one another. And also, there is an outside force, often other people, who are also trying to destroy, take, otherwise damage or impede the other people's flourishing. So who are we unified with? This song asks us consistently to choose the unpopular. This scripture, I think, is telling us, not necessarily pushing us toward, but just telling it plain. This will happen if you choose the underdog every time. That's gonna tick some people off. You know, the places that we take up in our family because we are pushing against someone at the Thanksgiving table to have that, you know, that evergreen metaphor, right? If we choose unity with the underdog, if we choose unity with the people who are the most marginalized, we kind of want to have it both ways, have our foot in both camps, be able to unify across. But if one group of people is causing violence or is upholding structural violence, and one group of people is having violence committed against them, whose side are you on? Whose side is God on? We read the Bible through the lens of the most marginalized. This scripture asks us, are you going to show up for me? Are you going to stand up for me? And we get really uncomfortable with the fact that boundaries exist. At some point, we may be asked to choose, that we can't have it both ways. Even in scripture, the privileged people who are intrigued by Jesus's message come under cover of darkness to come ask questions that they are afraid to ask during the daylight. It is not a zero sum, we are writing these people off forever, but asking us to discern a choice. Whose side are we on? So the second part of that gospel scripture is about reading the signs of the times. And sometimes I think that we can read the signs of the times correctly, but we're interpreting it wrong, right? So it says, if you see clouds coming up, you know that it's going to rain, right? Clouds coming off of the Mediterranean Sea is that metaphor. And then if you see a wind coming up in the south, that's from the desert, that you know it's about to get real hot, right? So Jesus is saying to the people listening to him, hey, you're reading this correctly. You know what you're looking at. But my question as a pastor and as a Christian in this time is, are we interpreting correctly? So we see that there is division. I hear that a lot, that we lament division. We're so divided as a country. That's a scary thing for us. But I think instead of perhaps trying to unify with people who want to kill our friends, that there is a choice to be made. We are reading division correctly, but this scripture is asking us, whose side are we on? Whose side is Jesus on? Whose side is God on? And are we courageous enough to set a boundary with violence, systemic and otherwise, and consistently choose the people that God consistently chooses? And this Isaiah chapter 5, right? This song of this beautiful vineyard that God has poured so much love and energy into, dug out a wine press, weeded everything, created a hedge around it, expecting it to produce good fruit. What we have to understand about the prophets is that they have been gifted a burning in their soul. They see something very wrong, right? And they are trying to put words to their experience of God in their context. And so, while I totally understand that it is kind of freaky to hear God removing the hedge around God's chosen people, right? And then kind of it being laid waste to. What you have to understand about the context of Isaiah is that the prophet is seeing the Assyrian army about to come in and actually lay waste to Jerusalem. So that's a very real thing. And in their faithful context, they are seeing that, oh no, we've been gifted this beautiful thing. And what did we do? We exploited people. We excluded people. We were not on the side of the most marginalized. And now this army's coming. They are making that connection. And whether or not we see that that is God's action or not is something for us to struggle with in this day and age. But they saw this Assyrian army coming in as a direct correlation for how they used or did not use, managed or mismanaged the resources in the land that they were given according to God's covenant. And I see it as so much a song of potential. This world is beautiful. It can flourish and everyone can have what they need. It can bear good fruit. And yet we as humans have created a world where that's not happening. And it's a song of lament. When you see ecological devastation, when you see the oppression of the most poor and marginalized, when you see mass incarceration, you see systemic racism, this is the vineyard that has already been laid waste to. That is something to grieve. We had hoped for justice. God had hoped for justice and saw only bloodshed. This creation was created good, and yet what did humans do to it? It's something to grieve. And then it's something to organize against. There was order and there can be order again. There was flourishing. There could be flourishing. There is the potential for flourishing. And there can be again. But we have to choose. What are we going to cultivate? Are we going to cultivate the rotten grapes? Are we going to cultivate the weeds? Are we going to cultivate whatever is stealing death and stealing life in this context? Or are we going to choose to invest in the people who need us? That, I think, is the fundamental question in these scriptures. It's uncomfortable. But so is actual peace. I think so often when we ask for unity, what we are asking for is the ceasing of agitation, the ceasing of discomfort. But who is silenced in that? The people who are crying out for justice. So whose side are we on? Is a discernment we have to make that these uncomfortable scriptures call us for. Call us to. You're reading the signs of the times correctly. Now we get our chance to respond.